So for those who may want a talk in philosophy of science, this will be soft philosophy of science. This is kind of like a lesson in the nature of science, the kinds of things that scientists themselves and people who engage with scientists might want to know, as opposed to academics. So this talk comes from work that I have been doing on studying error in science, which some people may say, no, science is all about being right. We don't make errors in science. But we do, and any historian will tell you that there are errors scattered through history everywhere. So over the last 20 years, I have been examining at least 200 different cases of error in science, and this is kind of like taking a little bit from all those cases about how it changes our view of science when we start acknowledging that error is an integral part of science and not just bad science. So I'm going to suggest, and I hope you would agree, that there are at least two aims to science. These are the ones that will matter today. We want to foster discovery, we want to make new knowledge, and at the same time, we want to avoid bad knowledge. We want to reduce error. And that error is the bridge collapse from my city, the 35W bridge collapse about 7 or 8 years ago that disrupted the traffic. So, for most of us, bias interferes with good science. And we can identify all kinds of ways in which we have bias that leads us away from the truth. So, sampling bias. We have too many of this kind and not enough of the other kind, so the sample is misrepresentative and we draw the wrong conclusions. Observer bias, or theory-laden observation. And so even people in the tropics who count leaves on trees to determine the amount of defoliation to show that some trees are more defoliated than others, if they know what the project is about and they know what the hypothesis is, they're counting what actually different. And some of these others, including gender bias, racial bias, and class bias. And we know that we think of these as interfering because we have developed methods to counteract these. So we are trying to correct for the bias. And in some ways, if we could, many of us might say, let's just get rid of gender bias. Let's just get rid of all these biases, and then science will be more effective. That's the side for trying to reduce error. On the side of, most of our views about error are based on errors based on perspectives or biases, so perspectival bias. On the other hand, we want to promote discovery. So there are 4 main theories about how creativity occurs in science. Genius. There are just some people who are smarter than the rest of us. Zeitgeist. So it is in the air. It is in the culture. Everyone's thinking a certain thing, and sooner or later, someone, maybe not the genius, will discover something. We do it by logic, we think logically, and by reasoning we come up with something, or by the total opposite, completely by chance, complete accident, where we stumble across something and say, ah, yes. So all our many famous discoveries, which we can trace to these things. So let us take an example that sort of illustrates how creativity may work. Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace both made a very important discovery: the evolution by means of natural selection. And so we may ask ourselves, how did these two people come up with the same idea? Was it just for anybody to find? Well, we don't have other people who discovered it at the same time. It was just these two people. But it turns out that there were elements of their lives that established perspectives on the world that were in parallel with each other, that if you study each of them individually, biographically, you will say, these are the factors that led to their discovery of natural selection. So they both studied biogeography, the distribution of animals, particularly ones that were divided by islands or by rivers. So there's a very famous comment from Alfred Russel Wallace, who did his collecting here in Brazil, in the Amazon. And he went back to England and he said, when you collect specimens, you have to say which side of the river you collected it from, not just which area, or that it was along the river, but it was on the east side of the Paraná or the west side of the Paraná, because the species were different. Already he was acknowledging that. They had both studied Lyell, Charles Lyell, and his theories of gradualism, which led them to understand that large changes might be built from many small changes. They had both read Thomas Malthus on population, which suggested that at certain times the population would be too large and that this would reduce the numbers. And this is, for each of them, this was kind of like the final insight that said, oh, but some organisms, not any organisms, are more likely to survive under those circumstances. And that was the key to natural selection. So those elements were combined especially for Darwin in his study of the rheas in Argentina and Patagonia. And when he did this, he saw these organisms on the voyage of the Beagle, which you all know. But they were particularly relevant because these species were being presented to the Zoological Society in London around the same time that Darwin actually developed his ideas of natural selection. On the other hand, Wallace was studying bird-winged butterflies in Indonesia, the home of what we now know to be the Wallace line. So here we have an example where their perspective, and these are in a sense biases that lead them to see some things as significant and other things as insignificant. And by combining the things that are significant, they make a discovery. So here we have this unusual combination of ideas. Perspectives have inherent biases. So the Mercator projection of the world gives us certain ideas about how to navigate along straight lines in the oceans. But it's a very different image from an inverted, recentered Peters projection, which is they are both equally valid maps of the world. Yes? But they create very different impressions. So, perspectives include, exclude, they focus on central features, they highlight some things as foreground, others as background, and especially for those of you who may have studied the notion of maps, they are selective, convention, contextual, and able to mislead. That's the more philosophical stuff. We can set that aside for now. So, what this means is that perspectives provide insights, they highlight certain things, at the very same time that they produce blind spots. They obscure other things. Well, that's interesting because it means that the ability to discover and the ability to make mistakes or errors are based on exactly the same thing. So you can't have discovery without also opening the opportunity for error. So I do not have a philosophical argument based on premises and logic to say why this should be true. I just have a series of interesting historical examples that show us how this works. So here is an example from chemistry of, so we'll go through a series of examples under these particular themes. So first we'll just look at individuals who had a perspective that led to a discovery on one occasion, and the same person with the same perspective to an error on another occasion. So Michael Faraday was one of the greatest scientific minds of the 19th century. Even if you're not a biologist, even if you are a biologist, Michael Faraday ranks up there, right along with Darwin. Okay. So Faraday is famous for having discovered electromagnetic induction and the reverse, which allowed for the invention of the electric motor. Basically showing that electricity and magnetism had a very intimate relationship with each other. So why did Faraday, as opposed to anyone else, discover this? In part, because of his religion. He was part of this small sect known as Sandemanians, and they believed in the unity of nature. And so he took that religious view into his science and basically decided that electricity and magnetism had to have an intimate relationship, and went about in the laboratory trying to discover it and document it. Well, that's fine. But he also thought that for the same reasoning that gravity and electricity had to have a very intimate relationship. So using some of the tools that he had, an experimental apparatus that he had used to establish the relationship of electricity and magnetism, he dropped coils of wires through gravity, hoping that they would, simply by falling through gravity, the gravity would induce electricity in these coils and he would be able to measure. Well, he was a good enough scientist to know that I tried this and it didn't work. Well, he put it on the shelf and came back to it a couple years later and did some more experiments, tried again because he was convinced that it was there, and he reported to the Royal Society, to all his peers and colleagues, I haven't found it yet, but it's there, just wait, I'll find it. And then 8 years later, he tried again, now that he could have a large tower that he could drop this little coil a larger distance, and it was still unsuccessful. Well, there is no gravimetric effect, not the way that Faraday thought. So he was right on one occasion, very important discovery, and an error on the other. Charles Darwin. Yes, we have to admit that Charles Darwin made some errors. It's okay, because he made far many more important discoveries, okay? So if we're okay with that, then we can talk about Darwin. So Darwin's very first scientific publication, you may know, was not biology, it was geology. It was a theory about the formation of coral atolls, that they were some volcanoes that had built coral reefs, rings, then eventually the volcanoes had eroded and created this ring of corals. This was his application of Lyell's thinking looking at what the coral atolls were and imagining their history, he was able to reconstruct it in small steps over a long period of time. Well, I think any of us would be glad to have this paper as our first scientific publication, because it was right and it really helped launch his career. But not long after, somewhat confident in his ability to use Lyell's reasoning, he applied the same reasoning to another geological puzzle, the parallel roads of Glenroy. How many people are already familiar with this case? Okay. So this is a valley in Scotland, and there are these little rock ledges. Now, what do you think might have created those ledges? Darwin went back into history and thought, these are the shorelines of a receding ocean. And he published this idea. But several years later, Agassiz came along with the notion of glaciers and ice ages, and was able to explain these not as a receding ocean, but as receding rivers of ice, receding glaciers. Darwin, to his credit, acknowledged his mistake. But what's interesting for us is we can see that he used exactly the same perspective, exactly the same bias to arrive at both conclusions. One was a monumental discovery, and the other was an error. This is about physics, so I won't spend too much time. But Charles Bartlett did win a Nobel Prize, so we have to give him credit for being a good scientist. And he was looking at the reflection of X-rays from different elements, realizing that they had different ways of reflecting things, and this allowed him to separate different kinds of elements. And Robert Moseley, building on this work, was able to establish the importance of atomic number, not atomic weight, in determining the order of the periodic table and its arrangement. Very important physical discovery that had overtones for chemistry. Bartlett continued his investigations and found another set of reflected things, which he gave a different name. Nobody really accepted this, but he worked on this for the rest of his career, and it turns out that there were other series, but they were caused by quantum effects of things, of the series that he already knew. And of course, Bartlett was an old-fashioned physicist. He did not accept quantum theory, so he just went on. So huge discovery, huge failure, again, based on the same perspective of studying X-rays. So those were all examples of individuals whose perspectives led to a pair of discoveries and errors. In some cases, the discoveries and the errors are kind of all mixed up together. So, Urbain and Leverrier looked at Newtonian mechanics, and there was a problem about the problem of Neptune because it didn't follow the right equations. So, using Newton's theory, said there must be another astronomical body producing gravity, pulling this thing out of orbit. He made the calculations, predicted that there would be a new planet, which eventually he sent this information off to an astronomer in Germany, who within a matter of hours confirmed the discovery. That was the discovery of Uranus. Wonderful account of discovery. Well, it turns out Mercury also has a kind of an orbit that isn't quite right according to Newtonian theory. And so Leverrier applied the very same reasoning to it, using the same kind of conclusion. There must be another planet. He named the planet Vulcan. This was long before Star Trek, by the way. But that's probably where they got it, you know. So he predicted this, and astronomers looked for 2 decades for this thing until they finally decided our observations should have revealed this planet if it was there. So we're just going to give up, even though they didn't have an answer to Mercury's orbit. So everyone had to wait until, by chance, by accident, along comes Albert Einstein with this new theory based on light and gravity. He calls it relativity, and was able to explain the wobble, or the precession of the precession of the perihelion of Mercury, and give an explanation that didn't involve changing the gravity, a new body. It was because of the very nature of gravity. So, discovery, error. And here are some fun ones. So you all remember doing spectroscopy in chemistry class? You look through the little spectroscopes at the flames from the particular elements, and you see specific lines that are associated with that element. Remember this? Yeah, okay. Well, this was a really wonderful discovery because you could look at various elements, and sometimes new lines would appear. So they knew, oh, there must be some element there that we haven't discovered yet. And based on the color of those lines, we discovered cesium, rubidium, red, thallium, bluish green, and scandium. Well, they continued their observations. They looked at the sun, and they saw spectrographic lines that did not fit any of the elements they already knew. So what do you conclude? There's a new element. And what would you call it? Based on the sun's corona? Oh, you are clever. Coronium. Yes. And this was listed on the table of the periodic elements. So if you walked into the chemistry classroom, there it would be coronium up at the top. And nebulium based on a spectrum from one of the nebulas. Well, you may wonder, like, I've never heard of coronium. I've never heard of nebulium. Are they really on the periodic table and I just wasn't paying attention? No, they are in fact mistaken things. And we needed much more advanced knowledge about higher orders of electron orbitals. We'll leave it to the chemists to explain. But again, discoveries and errors based on the same ideas. We could spend a little bit of time with Newton. He was pretty important, right? Well, not as important to start with, but important enough. Okay. So you all know his great works of Newton's laws of motions, the Principia, which established these various principles, the universal law of gravity. So Newton's idea was about that there was gravity between massive bodies, and that this determined the motions of the planets. All well and good. But then he thought atoms, that matter was made of small particles, or atoms. And what decided how atoms combine with each other? Well, you use the theory of gravity and you assume that the individual atoms or elements must have particular affinities to each other that determine how strongly they bond together. And if you put a third element in, it may have a stronger attraction and displace the original element. This was the basis for his theory of affinities, and chemists pursued this theory, largely based on Newton's reputation, for over a century establishing these elaborate charts about the order in which things would be replacing each other. This is what the periodic table would have looked like in the 18th century before they had actually identified all the elements and put them in order. This was the organizing principle of chemistry for 100 years, but only 100 years. They finally realized that a lot of what this was really about based on charge, and positive and negative ions connecting to each other, and the notion that individual atoms had individual affinities toward each other was given up as wrong. So, correct idea, incorrect idea. So, those are some examples of discoveries and errors that were combined with each other. I want to talk a little bit about some examples of, again, individuals who were biased in favor of discovery on one case and in favor of an error on another, and this very interesting string of cases. So, many of you may have heard of the notorious case of N-rays. So, René Blandon in France discovered this form of radiation that would produce an image, and dozens of his colleagues replicated this result. So presumably it was a reliable result. And here we see some of the images that were produced. This was an important discovery, we say, but Robert Wood from the United States came in, at first being very interested about learning how to replicate these things. And then eventually he just felt uncomfortable, and he started blocking the rays with pieces of wood, showing that they got the same results whether the rays were there or were not there. So Robert Wood exposed the bias of René Blandon and corrected the idea of N-rays. But Robert Wood had his own problems. There was similar kinds of proposals by Fred Allchin about this very complicated magneto-optical effect that if you use these chemicals in solution, they would rotate the light, the polarized light, and you would be able, based on the angles of these things and the distances, be able to determine which elements you have. And presumably this led to some more new elements, virginium and aluminium, which again, you've never heard of because they don't exist. But they were on the periodic table for a short period as well. And in this case, you might expect Robert Wood to have been a superior thinker and to have debunked Allison's work as well. But in fact, Robert Wood gave him a wholehearted endorsement in his chemistry text on chemical optics. So, just because he was good on one occasion, detecting error on one occasion, doesn't mean that he was able to do it on another. So, both of these cases, Blandon and N-rays and Allison and the magneto-optical effect, were characterized by Irving Langmuir as examples of pathological science, that somehow science had gone horribly wrong. Langmuir got his Nobel Prize, and I can't tell you how many things are named after Langmuir. There's Langmuir waves, Langmuir this, Langmuir that. There's the Langmuir scope, there are Langmuir currents in the ocean, and the American Chemical Society names their premier journal the Langmuir. So he was an extraordinarily astute chemist. But was it fair for him to criticize others simply for having gotten a wrong answer and then saying, well, I know better, you shouldn't have gotten the wrong answer? Because lo and behold, there are some of the examples of the things. Langmuir was a surface chemist, and he did work on cloud seeding. So his assistant found, by studying some things, that if you put carbon dioxide shavings into a cold thing, it would precipitate. He thought that this was a way to make clouds rain, weep, in a sense. And as soon as he got the result from his assistant, he went over to the local airfield, found some isolated clouds, shot carbon dioxide into them, and there was a little bit of rain, most of which evaporated before it got to the surface. And all the expert meteorologists said, yes, that was an interesting gimmick, but that's not really going to make an important thing. But Langner continued. He tested this on a hurricane down in Florida, shooting the carbon dioxide into the eye of the hurricane, hoping to disperse the hurricane, which then probably changed direction and went back inland and wreaked some havoc. But even the meteorologist said, yes, but it would have done that anyway. He continued his work out in Arizona, where there were very few clouds, hoping to make his proof, and publishing in Science magazine, one of the premier journals, that his work in Arizona and New Mexico, out in the west of the U.S., had influenced the weather several days later in Ohio, right in the middle of the country. And again, none of the meteorologists believe that. And of course, we now know in more detail that these effects were all spurious. So, pathological science, well, I think cloud seeding would fall into the category of what he called pathological science, but perhaps it's just better for us to understand that there are insights and they are blind spots, and they both come from individual perspectives. Okay, so I want to end with some really fun examples where scientists corrected each other. Normally we think, oh, well, there's one scientist and the smarter scientist who will correct them. We don't think that because of their individual perspectives, they have the power, theoretically, to correct each other if they make mistakes. And in fact, this has happened several times that we can think about. So, one of the first Nobel Prizes in medicine was about immunology. And it was shared between Paul Ehrlich, who had a humoral or chemical blood-based theory of immunity, and Ilya Mechnikov, who had a cell-based theory. So this would be based on phagocytes, white blood cells, which we know are very important in clearing foreign objects from our body. And Ehrlich was essentially giving us a preview of antibodies and immunoclearance. Well, they both said, no, I'm right and you're wrong. Ehrlich said there's no point in talking about cell-based immunity, and Mechnikov said, look, I have all this stuff about the cells. Why are you talking about the role of the blood? That's nonsense. Obviously, the Nobel Committee thought that they were both important and that they were correcting each other's blind spots. Another interesting case between Alessandro Volta and Luigi Galvani about animal electricity. So many of you know this case about animal electricity and the twitching of the frog's legs? Okay. So as biologists, Galvani, yes, he understood that there was something about electricity in the nature of nerves and muscles. And although it wasn't clear for several decades, he really made an important discovery. Most of the physicists will tell you that Galvani lost the debate. Volta blew him out of the water with true physics, and detected batteries showed that the whole thing about electricity was simply based on the chemistry of zinc and copper and little wet pieces of paper in between. So, large debate trying to struggle over the nature of animal electricity, and it turned out that both of them were right and both of them were wrong. They each had insights and they each had blind spots complementary to each other. This is an example from geology. Wonderful book by Martin Rudwick. Big, thick book about history of science. I recommend it as one of the most outstanding books in the history of science, but it's not biology, so we'll skip it. But we'll end with Darwin and Wallace. Yay! So, Darwin and Wallace, we saw, both made the same discovery, but not exactly. So, they both had to, in a sense, deal with this problem of the Victorian society that had splintered the classes. And how do you explain how some people are better off and some people are not? Is this a matter of natural selection? And what about the history of mankind? Where did humans come from? Darwin had had an experience in Tierra del Fuego with the natives, one of whom had been brought to London, civilized, taught the appropriate ways of British society. But when he returned to his tribes, Darwin was just appalled that he returned to his primitive native roots, shed his clothes, etc. Darwin was a member of the elite, and he saw society looking down, in a sense. So for him, the Fuegians were primitive humans. Even though they were modern, they still exhibited humans. And he talked about the difference between modern humans, his peers and the Fuegians, and the similar difference between the Fuegians and the orangutans, primates. Darwin, in a sense, was a racist. But ironically, this helped him to see the connections from one species to another that led him to endorse the idea of human evolution and that there would be gradual transitions. Wallace had a very different set of experiences. So he spent a lot of time in the Malay archipelago traveling around and depending on the natives. And here we have this wonderful, in a sense, rare historical photograph of his assistant, Ali, who cooked for him, did his wash, did his translations, helped him skin specimens. Wallace was impressed how even the most primitive tribes in Indonesia, in Java, were helpful and kind to him. And that led him to believe that there was an unresolvable gulf between humans and animals. So when it came time to human evolution, Wallace was a spiritualist. He believed that there was this magical leap from the primates to humans because there was some power that helped the evolution of the brain. So Darwin got the human evolution right, Wallace did not. Darwin got racism wrong, and Wallace was in census correction. So, one more example, 2 Nobel Prizes. That's fun because 2 competitors, each of whom won a Nobel Prize, partly for having corrected each other's mistakes. So, I apologize if this takes you back to your biology inside the cell and the energy processes in the mitochondria. Sometimes yes, I studied that. I tried to forget it. But in the 1950s, there was a theory that the electron transport chain in the inner membrane of the mitochondria produced ATP by generating these high energy intermediates that would then pass off their energy to ATP. Peter Mitchell comes along in 1961 with an alternative theory, the chemiosmotic hypothesis, saying, no, this membrane is important because we are moving electrons and hydrogen ions across the membrane and producing an electrochemical gradient, and this is what's fueling the production of ATP. So, Boyer not only believed in this hypothesis of these things, he published a paper in Science magazine, which was exceptionally well received by his colleagues, about having identified these molecules. Well, how ironic, the molecules don't exist. So the publication in Science magazine, but corrected by Peter Mitchell. But wait, Peter Mitchell had an idea about how the ATP enzyme worked, and that it was by direct protonation that somehow the hydrogen ions on one side of the membrane, as they trickled through, would cause the phosphate bond in ATP to be produced. It was a brilliant theory. I've looked at it in detail. But it was wrong. Boyer, on the other hand, pursued his ideas about the nature of proteins and their change in shape or conformation or configuration, and that the change in conformation of the ATP protein molecule, would produce ATP, and then it would be released, and this led to his rotating ATP model, for which he won the Nobel Prize in 1977. So, two great scientists, two Nobel Prize winners, each making great discoveries, but each correcting one of the errors of the other. So, this is how we might think about biases in science. Yes, they may mislead us, but if we have a corresponding bias in the other direction, we can remedy those biases and get a closer idea of the truth. Which leaves us with this very, perhaps uncomfortable, but still interesting conclusion that we can't have the discovery without there being a possibility of error. So, all based on historical examples in this case, but I think you'll agree, like, these are telling examples that tell us something important about the nature of science, that insights and blind spots in science are coupled together, and that, in a sense, is the puzzle, the unresolved conundrum of bias. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Douglas. I will just take off the recording, and we have some time for discussion. I don't know if someone wants to begin, and we have also people that are
We're all thinking of your own
connected. Yes.
So do you assume that biases and insights are premises that are not proven, or axioms that it's beholden to the individual that's the researcher?